At 21:03 on May 19, 1944, in the black, heaving waters east of the Solomon Islands, a 20-year-old sonar operator aboard the small American destroyer Escort USS England, D-635, lifted his headphones, froze for half a second, and whispered the words that would ignite one of the most staggering hunting streaks in naval history. Contact, bearing 085. England, barely a year old, under 1,500 tons, armed with a new and untested Hedgehog system, crewed mostly by young men who had never seen a submarine up close, was about to launch the opening strike in a 12-day campaign that would end with 6 Japanese submarines destroyed, a feat no other ship of World War II, Allied or Axis, would ever match. In the darkness below, an enemy submarine moved silently through the depths, convinced it was undetected, unaware that every ping from England's sonar was tightening a noose it could not see. How could a modest escort vessel, not a battleship, not a carrier, not even a full destroyer, become the single most lethal submarine hunter of the entire Pacific War? And what chain of decisions, instincts, and impossible luck transformed this unremarkable ship into a legend whispered across the fleet? By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered a brutal new phase, one in which geography, logistics, and information mattered as much as firepower. The United States was preparing for the Marianas Campaign, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, an operation that required thousands of transports, hundreds of warships, and absolute freedom to move across vast stretches of ocean, while the Imperial Japanese Navy, weakened but still dangerous, sought every possible advantage to detect, disrupt, or ambush these movements. To compensate for shrinking surface strength, Japan relied heavily on its submarine scouting lines, long chains of boats positioned in arcs across strategic corridors, each reporting American fleet movements through coded transmissions. These lines functioned like an undersea radar net, and one of the most important in 1944 was the newly reformed NA/Northeast Line northeast of the Solomons, staffed by boats such as I-16, RO, 104, RO, 105, RO, 106, RO, 108, and RO, 116. If these submarines remained intact, they could provide intelligence that might allow Japanese forces to time carrier strikes, intercept troop convoys, or reposition defensive fleets before the Americans reached the Marianas. Against this backdrop sailed USS England, a Buckley-class destroyer escort, less than 100 meters long, lightly armored, powered by diesel-electric engines, armed with depth charges and a new forward-firing Hedgehog projector, and designed not for fleet battles, but for relentless, methodical anti-submarine warfare. Destroyer escorts were the unseen backbone of the Pacific supply chain, escorting convoys, patrolling lonely routes, and hunting submarine shadows in waters where a single mistake could send a 200-man crew to the bottom in minutes. England's mission in May 1944 was simple in writing but enormous in implication. Assist in locating a single suspected submarine believed to be providing intelligence to the Japanese command. The broader context, which few aboard fully appreciated, was that Admiral Somu Toyoda's combined fleet depended on these scouting submarines to track American operations. Losing just one weakened the line, but losing several could blind Japanese intelligence altogether. Meanwhile, American technology was evolving rapidly. Improved sonar sets like the QC series could detect changes in echo patterns caused by a submarine turning or altering depth, while Hedgehog offered a transformative advantage. Unlike traditional depth charges that exploded at preset depths and often lost the target, Hedgehog bombs detonated only upon direct contact, meaning that a single accurate firing run could cripple a submarine instantly without obscuring sonar with turbulence. As the Marianas invasion loomed, the stakes surrounding this new undersea duel rose sharply. Japan hoped its scouting line would give it forewarning to marshal defenses or attempt a decisive strike, while the United States needed the line neutralized to ensure its enormous invasion force could move unmolested. England, operating with Task Group 34, found herself in this invisible battle of attrition, one ship among many, her young crew unaware that within days they would become the decisive factor in dismantling an entire Japanese intelligence network. The waters where England patrolled, deep, warm, unpredictable, favored submarine concealment, and many officers believed that hunting Japanese subs was a slow, frustrating task defined more by luck than skill. Yet England's crew trained relentlessly in sonar tracking, attack approach, and Hedgehog employment, performing drills at all hours until they could transition from detection to firing in minutes. Even so, no amount of training could guarantee success. The Japanese submarines they faced were stealthy, commanded by veterans, and capable of diving deep to escape pursuit. As dusk settled on May 19th, USS England steamed into a region where 6 enemy submarines formed the backbone of Japan's forward surveillance. No one aboard could guess that, over the next 12 days, those same 6 submarines would all be lying on the ocean floor, and that their ship, built quietly in Maine and manned by men barely out of training schools, would rewrite the logic of submarine warfare in the Pacific. The question was no longer whether England could find one submarine, but whether she could survive the intelligence war swirling beneath the surface. To understand how USS England achieved her unprecedented 12-day killing streak, it is necessary to look beyond the steel hull and the specifications on paper and examine the human and organizational forces that converged aboard her, shaping a crew of young Americans into the finest submarine hunters of the Pacific. England herself was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, one of dozens of lean, efficient ships designed in wartime urgency to guard convoys, sweep submarine routes, and fill the growing need for anti-submarine warfare platforms. But the ship's hardware alone did not explain what happened in May 1944. What mattered were the men inside her narrow passageways, the officers barely in their late 20s, the enlisted sailors scarcely older than boys, and the mindset forged through training, improvisation, and circumstance. Lieutenant Commander Walton B. Pendleton, England's commanding officer, was not a flamboyant captain but a quiet, methodical leader who demanded relentless proficiency from his crew. He understood intuitively that submarine warfare was a duel of patience and sensory discipline, not heroics, and he molded the ship into a listening instrument, a vessel that could interpret the faintest underwater whispers and turn them into precise killing strikes. His executive officer, Lieutenant John Williamson, was equally calm and sharp, a tactician comfortable making split-second decisions when a sonar echo shifted, a bearing changed, or a target attempted to slip away into deeper water. But perhaps the most crucial figures aboard were the sonar operators, men like Sonarman 3rd Class George Jimmy Grider, whose days and nights were spent with headphones pressed against their ears, filtering through static, plankton scatter, propeller cavitation, and thermal layers to distinguish the rhythmic, metallic pulse of a submarine moving hundreds of feet below the surface. These operators were trained to identify the difference between a submarine turning and one diving, between a contact approaching and one drifting with the current. A single misinterpretation could waste an attack run or, worse, expose the ship to a torpedo counterstrike. Grider, barely 20, possessed an unervingly sharp auditory memory, able to recall the signature of each submarine they pursued, the timbre of its screws, the tempo of its propellers, skills born not from innate talent alone, but from countless hours in a cramped, red-lit sonar room during training cruises. Pendleton cultivated this talent ruthlessly, running his crew through drill after drill until transitions from detection to attack were faster than the manual recommended. At the heart of England's potency was the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon that fired 24 contact-detonated bombs in a tight elliptical pattern. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at preset depths and disrupted sonar readings for minutes afterward, Hedgehog bombs exploded only if they struck the submarine's hull, meaning a clean miss left the watercom and sonar fully functional. The psychological effect was enormous. The crew would fire the Hedgehog salvo, then listen, in absolute, suffocating silence, for the telltale crump of an underwater detonation. If they heard nothing, the tension returned instantly. If they heard the explosion, they knew they had hit steel, torn open pressure hulls, and consigned dozens of enemy sailors to the ocean floor. Understanding what drove England's mission also requires examining Japan's naval strategy at the time. After the crushing losses of 1942 and 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy no longer possessed the carrier strength to meet the Americans in open battle at will. Instead, Their doctrine increasingly relied on long-range submarines positioned in defined scouting arcs, reporting fleet movements back to command. These scouting lines, interconnected, disciplined, and strategically placed, were intended to provide the eyes Japan needed to predict where the U.S. Navy would strike next. In early 1944, Tokyo sought to reconstitute the NA/NE line, a chain of submarines north and east of the Solomons, designed to detect American preparations for the invasion of the Marianas. If this line succeeded, Japanese commanders hoped to launch their air and naval forces in a coordinated, decisive blow. If it failed, the American fleet would reach the Marianas undetected and unopposed. USS England entered this domain not by accident, but because of operational intelligence. U.S. codebreakers intercepted Japanese transmissions indicating a new submarine was en route to the NA/NE line. Pendleton's ship, working alongside the destroyer escorts USS George and USS Raby, was dispatched to investigate. This decision, made far from the front line by analysts decoding messages in dim intelligence huts, became the spark that ignited England's extraordinary run. The men on England did not initially know the significance of their mission. Most believed they were chasing a single enemy submarine, perhaps two. But with every engagement, every sonar echo, and every sinking, the crew began to grasp that they were not fighting isolated targets, but dismantling a chain essential to Japan's strategic vision. Motivations aboard ship ranged from professional pride to sheer survival. A submarine that escaped contact could circle back and launch torpedoes at England or the larger convoy behind her. Thus, each engagement was a matter of preemption. Kill the enemy before he kills someone else. These stakes infused the crew with a grim resolve. They fought not with the swagger of battleship crews, but with the quiet, grinding intensity of hunters who knew they had only seconds to interpret sonar bearings, plot attack vectors, and fire before the ocean swallowed the target again. Eyewitness recollections capture the psychological pressure vividly. One sailor remembered how the sonar room felt like the center of the world, a tiny red-lit chamber where time stretched and breath froze as operators listened for patterns in the static. Another recalled how firing Hedgehog salvos left the entire crew suspended between hope and dread, straining for the muffled explosion that meant success, and knowing that silence meant the submarine was still alive, still maneuvering, still deadly. The Japanese submariners faced their own brutal calculus. Their boats were large, long-range vessels designed for scouting and special missions, not high-speed evasion. Their sonar countermeasures were limited, and many captains underestimated the precision of American weapons. Still, they were no amateurs. The crews of I-16 and the RO series boats were disciplined, experienced, and skilled in operating under thermal layers or cutting engines to evade detection. Yet in every duel, England's crew proved faster, sharper, more coordinated. Each success reinforced their confidence, and each new contact layered more pressure onto Japanese commanders desperately trying to keep the scouting line intact. The deeper cause behind England's success lay in the perfect alignment of human discipline, technological superiority, intelligence breakthroughs, and tactical doctrine. A single missing piece, a late sonar report, a faulty Hedgehog salvo, a misjudged bearing, could have doomed the ship. But in those 12 days, everything clicked, every system, and every man operating near flawless efficiency. This convergence of skill, timing, and determination transformed England from a modest escort into the executioner of an entire Japanese undersea network. And as the crew realized the scale of their mission, as each sinking added weight to their shoulders, they sensed that they were no longer merely escorting convoys. They were shaping the fate of the Pacific War, one submarine at a time. At midnight on May 20th, 1944, barely hours after the first sonar echo had rippled through the headphones of USS England's operators, the hunt began in earnest, the ship moving swiftly through the dark Pacific swells in a sweeping arc calculated to intercept the submarine whose presence had been whispered through intercepted Japanese messages. The contact strengthened, then wavered, then returned. A pulsing heartbeat beneath the ship, and Lieutenant Commander Pendleton ordered England to full hunting posture, sonar tracking at maximum sensitivity, radar sweeping the horizon for periscopes or masts, Depth charge crews standing by though knowing Hedgehog would strike first. At 1:44 the sonar tone sharpened, definite submarine, range decreasing, and England surged forward at 15 knots, turning tightly to align her bow with the target. Sonarman Grider called out bearings, voice steady despite the adrenaline, and Williamson, calculating the submarine's attempted dive, shouted fire. A volley of 24 Hedgehog projectiles arced ahead in a parabola and splashed down in elliptical formation. The crew held their breath, seconds stretching into eternity until a dull, heavy crump rolled up from the depths, followed by a second explosion, then a chain of fainter, final detonations as I-16's hull shattered under thousands of pounds of pressure. Oil rose to the surface. Debris floated in the moonlight. England had drawn first blood, but it was only the beginning. At 6 o'clock, another message flashed across the task group network. Intelligence suggested a second submarine was racing to replace the fallen I-16 along the NA/NE line. England, George, and Raby formed a loose net, sweeping in parallel at 5-mile intervals, sonar pings cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. At 8:27 England detected faint propeller beats, slower than I-16, consistent with the smaller RO-class submarines, and immediately closed the distance. RO-106, unaware that its coded transmissions had long been compromised, maintained its scouting patrol at shallow depth. At 9:10 England made her first attack run. Miss. The submarine dove sharply to 200 feet and tried to break contact under a thermal layer. At 9:31 Grider shouted. Contact regained, bearing steady, and England wheeled around violently. Engines vibrating, crew braced for impact as the ship's bow cut across the submarine's projected path. Another Hedgehog spread roared into the air, plunging beneath the surface. Again the crew listened for the only sound that mattered, and after 8 dreadful seconds, a cluster of detonations blossomed in the depths, a muffled cascade signaling a direct hit. RO-106 was gone. 2 submarines in less than 24 hours, an achievement unheard of in naval warfare, sent tremors through the Japanese scouting line, but the Imperial Navy, believing the losses coincidental, dispatched RO-104 and RO-108 to seal the gap. England, meanwhile, pressed her advantage with predatory precision. On May 22 at 15:42 the sonar room crackled again. New contact, bearing 062, slow screws, depth 150. The sea was calm, a deceptive, glass-like surface masking the violent duel building below. RO-104 attempted a classic evasion maneuver, turning sharply to port and cutting power to minimize cavitation noise. But England's sonar crew tracked the change instantly, calling out readings with machine-like rhythm. Williamson adjusted course, maintaining optimal firing angle, and at 16:22 ordered another Hedgehog salvo. The bombs plunged into the water, sinking silently for several agonizing moments until a deep, booming explosion thudded upward through the hull. A column of oil and shattered plating soon followed. 3 submarines down. By now England's reputation within Task Group 30 was shifting from lucky to uncannily lethal. But the crew had no time to savor the victories. Each kill meant another gap in the scouting network, and Japan scrambled to plug it. The next challenger, RO-108, approached the region from the northwest. On May 23 at 5 o'clock England picked up a faint, irregular echo, RO-108 attempting to mask its noise by traveling above a thermocline. Pendleton ordered a cautious approach, throttling back engines to reduce self-noise. For nearly an hour England shadowed the submarine, closing inch by inch until sonar reported an ideal range for attack. At 6:41 the Hedgehog fired again. Silence. More silence. Then a single, sharp explosion erupted below, one unmistakable blast confirming a deadly hit. RO-108 sank with all hands. For submarines in 4 days, Japanese headquarters could no longer dismiss the pattern. Panic simmered through the coded network. The NA/NE line, a critical component of their intelligence screen, was collapsing. Admiral Toyota rerouted RO-105, the most experienced and successful of the remaining submarines, toward the area. RO-105's commander, Lieutenant Commander Harada, was a veteran of long patrols and understood anti-submarine tactics far better than his predecessors. When RO-105 arrived in the region on May 24th, Hirata immediately went silent running. Engines at minimal output, cruising at 250 to 300 feet to avoid detection. For hours, England heard nothing. At 10:30, the sonar operator on USS George detected a faint contact. England, operating closest, was directed to investigate. By 12:17, England had the submarine's bearing, but RO-105 executed a sharp, unexpected turn and escaped the firing arc. Twice England ran attack patterns. Twice the submarine slipped away at the last second. The duel lasted nearly 4 hours, a tense underwater chess match between hunter and hunted. Then, at 14:33, Grider detected a subtle shift, RO-105 increasing speed, perhaps believing it had escaped. That was the opening Williamson needed. England surged to 18 knots, swung bow first across the predicted rise of the target, and fired Hedgehog. This time the bombs fell into perfect spread. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 7. Then a violent, rolling rumble erupted from below, shaking the deck. RO-105 was lost. 5 submarines in barely 5 days. Japan's scouting line was no longer damaged, it was annihilated. Only one submarine remained in the region, RO-116, commanded by a determined officer named Lieutenant Yoshimura, who had been warned that an American escort was methodically destroying every submarine in the line. Yoshimura planned to exploit England's confidence by using an unorthodox tactic. He cut his engines entirely and allowed RO-116 to drift silently in a deep thermal layer, betting that the absence of cavitation would make him invisible. For most ships, this would have worked. But England's sonar crew, trained to detect microechoes, noticed an intermittent, unnatural flutter at 22:04 on May 26th. They couldn't confirm it was a submarine, but they couldn't ignore it either. For over an hour, England shadowed the anomaly, gradually tightening the circle, mapping the aberration's movements until Grider finally announced what everyone suspected: contact confirmed. Submarine drifting. Williamson, careful not to spook the target, ordered England to maintain minimal wake, closing silently. At 23:41, the final Hedgehog spread launched, arcing out in a wide spray that descended into the water in near total silence. Seconds later, a massive detonation burst upward as RO-116's hull ruptured under the barrage. With that, the 6th submarine, and the last operational boat in the NA/NE line, was gone. The ocean's surface, moments earlier calm and black, boiled with rising oil, the only visible sign of the destruction below. The crew of USS England stood in stunned silence. 6 submarines in 12 days. No other ship in World War II had achieved such a kill record. Not a battleship, not a carrier, not a cruiser, not even an entire task force. England had single-handedly gutted Japan's forward intelligence net, blinding an entire theater of operations, all through a combination of relentless training, flawless sonar work, precise Hedgehog employment, and nerves of steel. Yet the victory was not merely tactical, it was psychological. The men aboard the Escort had undergone 12 days of constant readiness, disrupted sleep, high tension, and moral conflict. Each explosion meaning dozens of enemy sailors dying in the silent dark. Some crew members later admitted they felt pride and sorrow intertwined. Pride that they had accomplished the impossible, and sorrow for the men whose last moments had been spent trapped beneath crushing tons of seawater. But for now, as the moon cast its pale reflection across the oily swells, they simply stared at the calm surface, knowing they had rewritten naval history in less than 2 weeks, and suspecting, quietly, that no one on land would ever fully understand what it took to wage a war fought not in thunder and fire, but in the faint, cold echoes of sonar pings deep beneath the Pacific waves. When the final echoes of RO-116's destruction faded into the black Pacific night, the immediate consequence was stark, measurable, and devastating for the Imperial Japanese Navy. An entire intelligence barrier, the NA/NE picket line, had ceased to exist, 6 submarines wiped from the order of battle in less than 12 days, leaving Admiral Toyoda's fleet blind to American carrier movements across thousands of nautical miles. Where once submarines had reported task groups, counted hull. silhouettes, and relayed coordinates crucial for planning ambushes. Now only silence filled the sea lanes. And that silence carried a price far beyond statistics. After-action assessments from U.S. Pacific Fleet analysts concluded that Japan's inability to track Task Force 58 during the lead-up to the Battle of the Philippine Sea directly contributed to the catastrophic Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where Japan lost over 600 aircraft and its remaining carrier strength collapsed. Without submarine scouts, the Japanese Navy launched strikes into empty ocean, guessing instead of knowing, reacting instead of planning. USS England's 12-day rampage had not simply destroyed 6 submarines. It had cracked the logic of Japan's entire reconnaissance network at a decisive moment. But the consequences resonated on England's deck as well. Many sailors later described the strange emotional whiplash that followed the adrenaline-soaked days of nonstop combat. The sudden quiet, the knowledge that each explosion they had felt through the steel plates had meant dozens of men dying unseen in the crushing dark below. Some wrote in letters home that they could not celebrate. Even as higher command praised them. In a rare wartime commendation, Admiral Ernest King himself stated, "There will always be an England in the United States Navy," a line that echoed through naval history and eventually inspired naming a new USS England after the war. Yet the original England never received the kind of memorial or recognition bestowed upon famous carriers or battleships. She was too small, too specialized, too modest in appearance to capture the public imagination. But among sonar operators, destroyer escort crews, and anti-submarine warfare specialists, the ship became a legend, proof of what relentless practice, disciplined teamwork, and absolute trust in new technology, especially the Hedgehog system, could accomplish. Strategists studying post-war submarine doctrine treated England as a case study in how a single, flexible, fast-reacting unit could dismantle a far larger system through precision rather than brute force. Meanwhile, in Japan, the loss became a symbol of futility. Commanders interviewed after the war admitted that once the picket line collapsed, they could no longer assemble a coherent view of the Pacific battlespace, and from that point forward, their operations resembled fighting through fog. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was human, not technical. Veterans of England recalled the 12 days as the longest of their lives, a condensed lifetime of tension, doubt, fatigue, and bursts of terrifying clarity. Some remembered the eerie stillness between explosions, the moments when they wondered whether they were hunters or simply lucky to be alive. Others remembered the faces of friends who had steadied their hands during frantic attack runs. And when the war ended, many carried with them a quiet burden. The knowledge that victory at sea often meant death delivered invisibly, without the fire and thunder of surface battles, but with the cold precision of sonar echoes and silent projectiles. Still, they understood the significance. Their actions had saved American sailors, protected carrier groups, and hastened the collapse of Japanese naval power. USS England's legacy survives in Navy training manuals, in tactical discussions about small unit lethality, and in the minds of historians who view her rampage as one of the greatest anti-submarine achievements ever recorded. And though the sea long ago washed away the debris, the oil slicks, and the rising bubbles that marked the graves of 6 submarines, the memory of a small escort ship, manned by young Americans who refused to break, still lingers on the surface of the Pacific, a quiet reminder that sometimes the most decisive blows in war are struck not by giants, but by those no one expected to matter. In the end, when the last echo of sonar faded and the Pacific returned to its quiet, rolling darkness, the story of USS England stood not merely as a record of 6 submarines destroyed in 12 days, but as a testament to what determination, discipline, and unshakable trust between ordinary men can achieve. The young sonar operator who first whispered contact on May 19th could never have imagined that his words would ignite a chain of events reshaping an entire theater of war, blinding an enemy fleet, and carving his ship's name into naval history. Yet beneath the statistics, beneath the citations and after-action reports, lies the simple truth that war is fought by people, frightened, exhausted, courageous people, who rise to meet impossible moments without knowing whether they will survive them. As England sailed away from the oil-stained waters where 6 submarines now rested, Her crew carried with them the weight of what they had done and the knowledge that their actions saved thousands of lives they would never meet. And perhaps that is the quiet paradox of their achievement, that the most decisive blows in the vast Pacific War were struck not with grand fleets or towering battleships, but through the steady heartbeat of sonar pings and the resolve of a crew no one had expected to matter. So as we remember the ship and the men who served aboard her, we must ask ourselves, in an age obsessed with power and scale, do we still recognize the extraordinary potential of the overlooked and the underestimated? If this story moved you, consider sharing it so others may understand the courage behind those 12 days at sea. And subscribe to the channel to keep alive the untold histories of those who sacrificed everything in the silent depths of World War II.